All right, for the last part of your study guide, you do need to label the processes of the water cycle, okay? I had recorded this as I was typing, or as I was writing it in, but it had some issues. So the part of the diagram where it's pointing from the pond, the arrow's going up, that is showing evaporation, right? The sun, technically, I guess there should be like a sun right here. The sun would heat up the water in the lake or the pond or a stream, and those molecules again begin to vibrate faster and faster until they eventually break free from the liquid and float up into the air as a gas. Once they get high enough into the atmosphere, they begin to cool. Okay, this is the condensation part of the cycle. And once enough water has condensed, it will form the clouds that you can kind of see here. It's a little light, all right? And then once the clouds get too heavy and too full of condensation, then the condensation falls to the ground, and that is the precipitation, all right? The precipitation then runs off, and we go back to evaporation all over again. So, below the diagram, we're going to define each part of the water cycle. That just means describe what happens during each part. The first one we're going, actually here, we'll do it like this. Evaporation. Evaporation is when liquid water, I'm gonna have to kind of turn this a little bit so that I can, okay. This is when liquid water heats up and goes from a liquid to a gas, which in this case we call water vapor. Okay, those are the two main parts to remember, is it's going from a liquid to a gas, okay? Because the opposite is the next one, condensation. Okay, condensation is when water vapor cools. And goes from a gas to a liquid. Okay, so this is the opposite. Instead of going from a liquid to a gas, condensation is going from a gas back to a liquid. And then the last part of the water cycle is precipitation. Which is rain, snow, sleet, or hail falling from the atmosphere to Earth's surface. Okay. Okay, then give two examples of condensation in everyday life. We talked about a few of these in the actual notes. One was fog on the bathroom mirror. Okay. Another was when you have a soda can that starts sweating, is what we like to call it, but really it's when those drops of water begin to form on the can and then begin to drip down because the can is so much colder than the air outside. Or you could say, whoa, fog on the windows when it's cold outside. Okay, Okay, so I gave 3, but you only have to give 2. If you have another one, that's fine. Just make sure it is an example of condensation. Most of Earth's water is what kind of water? That's going to be salt water. Sorry, I can't write. This tripod that I'm using to hold up my phone is exactly where my arm needs to be to write. So, what drives the water cycle? This is actually an important question. There's one thing that the water cycle would not happen without, and that is the sun, okay? If we didn't have the sun, okay, then water never heats up, so that heated water vapor can never cool, therefore there's no precipitation. Water would just stay where it is without the sun there to evaporate some of the water off the surface. So, what drives the water cycle? The answer is the sun. And then what force contributes to the water cycle? There's only one force that plays a major effect in the water cycle, and that is gravity. Okay, so while the sun heats up the water vapor, or heats up the water, creating the vapor, okay, like we see up here, if there was no force of gravity pulling that water back down to the surface, that water vapor would just escape all the way up through the atmosphere, okay? So gravity is really what causes the precipitation to fall as well. So what drives the water cycle, what causes it is the sun, but then the force that participates in it as well is gravity. Now, how does water vapor get into the air? This question, you actually need to be pretty specific, okay? Because I don't want you to just tell me, oh, it heats up. Okay, yes, technically it does, but what happens as the water begins to heat up? How does water vapor get into air? So your answer should be something like this. The water molecules in the liquid begin to move quickly, which we described as that vibrating that we were talking about. Sorry, you can't really see this. The water molecules in the liquid begin to move quickly as they heat up until they, wow, this is really hard to write, until they break free into the air as a vapor, which is also known as a gas. Okay, so you need to include that the heat is what causes the water molecules to begin moving, and eventually they move so quickly that they actually break free from the liquid altogether and escape into the air as a gas. All right, I don't want to get to this just yet. On the last page, it says explain the difference. Whoa, got a little shaky there. It says explain the difference between rotation and revolution. This should be pretty simple based on what we talked about for the quiz. Rotation is when the object itself is actually spinning. Or another way to say that is when the object is turning around. Okay? However, revolution is when the object moves around something else. Okay, so again, this would be something like a rotation. The object itself is actually turning or spinning, okay? However, if I took the pen and moved it around my finger, Now the pen is revolving around the finger. It's moving around something else. It's not actually spinning. Okay, that's rotation, revolution. Now, is it possible for something to do more than one at one time? Yes. In fact, that's exactly what the Earth does, so that would make sense. Okay? How is weather different from climate? Well, climate is how the weather usually is in the area. Okay, another way to say that is this is what is expected. Okay, so Florida, like we said, okay, that typically has a climate that is hot and sunny, but that particular day, the weather may not exactly line up with the typical climate. Okay, so how do we define weather? Weather is the atmosphere's conditions, okay, so temperature, humidity, air pressure, all those things, is the atmosphere's conditions right now. That's the important part in that area, okay? It's what we call instantaneous, has to do with it right that instant, all right? This question should be, sorry, I'm trying to move this so I can actually do something and make it look neater. This should be a repeat from the quiz, but what causes day and night on Earth? The rotation of the Earth on its axis. Now, one thing I want to note, you cannot just leave your answer like this, especially for an essay question where the directions say, answer in one or more complete sentences. This is not a complete sentence. The rotation of Earth on its axis. Okay, well, what about the rotation of Earth on its axis? So, I need to finish that answer. The rotation of Earth on its axis causes day and night. Okay, now I could just put a period there and that would be a complete sentence and we're good to go. But I'm going to go on a little bit further because this is what gives the appearance of a sun that rises and sets. Okay, we've talked a lot about how the sun doesn't actually move. Instead, we are moving, which makes it look like the sun's moving across the sky, but really it's the rotation of the Earth that causes that movement. Okay, and then the last question I answered just a little bit ago on when talking about the water cycle. How do the sun and ocean interact in the water cycle? The sun heats up the water in the ocean, causing evaporation, which starts off the water cycle. Okay, and you could really go on to say that without the sun, water would just stay where it is. It would either be on the Earth, or it would be in the air, or it would be falling down. Okay, so you can make that argument, but one way to say that is the sun heats up the water in the ocean, causing evaporation, which starts off the water cycle. Okay, because then the other steps follow on after that. Now, the last thing I want to note for your study guide, let me zoom out a little bit so you can see maybe a little better. Okay, the last thing I want to note for your study guide is there is one thing you do need to study that is not actually on this study guide. So at the bottom here, I want you to put a star and you're going to write the following that I have on this sticky note. Okay, it says also study the weather variables and weather tools. Okay, so this particular part of the test is, you're gonna have to tell me, does temperature describe how much water vapor is in the air? Well, no, the answer is humidity is just how much water vapor is in the air, okay? Or something like a barometer is what measures air pressure. Okay, yes, that is true. A barometer is what you use to measure air pressure. So this should be in your weather versus climate notes. I want to say it was notes number 5, but I'm not 100% sure. So go back to that section. I gave you definitions for each of the weather variables and the weather tools. If you want to, you can just rip off that last page of your notes there, or that part of your notes, and kind of staple it or put it right behind your study guide. That way you have it all in one place. But this whole thing is what you need to study for the test. As well as the weather variables and weather tools, and also that one set of notes that deals with the characteristics of the earth, moon, and sun, notes number 7. So do not wait till the last second to go over these. Make sure you give yourself enough time to forget these before you go back and study them again. It sounds kind of funny and opposite of what we would think, but if you actually let yourself forget this and then try to remember it again, you will remember it better when it comes time for the test. So let me know if you have any questions, but make sure you keep this in a safe place.